So what push should the Foreign Affairs Minister John Baird make to his key counterparts in Eastern Europe? And what will it take for the peace deal between Ukraine and Russia to hold? Joining me now from Winnipeg, James Bezan, the Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of National Defence. Peggy Nash is the NDP's industry critic. She's joined us from Toronto and in Montreal. Mark Garneau is the Liberal Foreign Affairs critic. Good to have all of you here. Mr. Bezan, let's just start with this peace deal, this truce in Geneva. Russia and Ukraine agreed to de-escalate violence, but yesterday, of course, we saw people killed at a checkpoint where Nalayed was just in Sloviansk. Is this Geneva Accord more than a piece of paper? Can it do anything?
Well, it all comes down to the parties that signed it and whether or not they're prepared to implement it. And unfortunately, what we've seen occur over the weekend, over the Easter weekend, you would expect that there would be a step back from the violence and aggression and provocative measures that were being expressed in the Donetsk Oblast. And unfortunately, things continue to escalate. And, I would hope that the language coming from President Putin and the Kremlin would have encouraged pro-Russian forces as well as special ops forces that are on the ground in Ukraine would have said that we're going to step back and allow this peace process to work. But unfortunately, as has been expressed by many of the world leaders, including President Obama and Prime Minister Harper, is that we're somewhat skeptical on whether or not we're going to see an actual implementation of the accord.
Peggy Nash, John Baird starts his Eastern European trip tomorrow. The Czech Republic, Slovakia, Poland, Latvia, Estonia. In your view, given what's happening in Ukraine, given, you heard James Bezan talk about Russia and the use of special forces there under the guise of Russian nationalists, what do you think the goal of his trip should be vis-a-vis NATO?
Well, certainly the key priority has to be to de-escalate the situation and to have the agreement that was reached last Thursday respected. I think that there were certainly fears that if violence took place in eastern Ukraine, things would start to unravel. And I think the minister's approach has to be to do everything possible to shore up that agreement. And I think the support and resolve of neighboring countries like the Balkan states and Poland is important to maintaining that de-escalation. And NATO, I think, can also play an important role in bringing the temperature down, but also assuring Ukrainians that they do have NATO backing and
what does that
they
mean?
do have support.
What does NATO back? I mean, again, we're trying to separate words from intention. What does NATO backing mean? If there are Russian troops in Donetsk or Sloviansk, they're not troops yet, but the governments are alleging there are special forces there. Does NATO backing actually open the door, in your view, to NATO action on the ground in Ukraine?
No, I don't think that's what it means. I think what it means is a determination to have the agreement respected and to show that at least on the side of the other parties, the U.S., Europe, and Ukraine, that there is a determination to have this agreement respected and to de-escalate the violence. That's what people want, and they want the elections to take place later next month. And the fear is that this unraveling of the agreement and any escalating violence could undermine those democratic elections.
We'll get to those democratic elections. Let me bring in Mark Garneau. What message does the minister have to send to those countries vis-a-vis NATO and send to Russia?
Well, one of solidarity, because obviously the problem here is that Mr. Putin thinks that he may be able to do what he did in Crimea. The truth of the matter is that the truce itself, signed in Geneva, is not working. One would think perhaps the message is not getting to the pro-Russian separatists who are occupying buildings in eastern Ukraine, but that wouldn't be the truth. The fact is the message can get to them. I'm not sure that the Russians is sort of pushing them to lay down their arms and to walk away from the buildings. And this is unfortunate because those pro-Russian separatists are hoping for another Crimea. They're hoping for a referendum. They're hoping that Russia will come in. It's not going to happen in East Ukraine. It's a completely different situation from Crimea. I think at the moment what's important is for NATO countries to show their solidarity and to show President Putin that he's not just going to get to do what he did in Crimea.
James Bezan, some sources have told me that the Ukrainian government is considering changing these elections from elections to a referendum on whether parts want to be on Russia. What has the Canadian government heard about that at all?
Well, actually, I hadn't heard that before. I know that there's definitely people within the pro-Russian movement in eastern Ukraine that want to see those types of referendums take place. But I believe that the overall theme of May 25th is to have a fair and open election process for president. And I think that you're going to see President Putin and the Russian Federation do everything possible to prevent those elections from taking place. That's why it's important that Vice President Biden is in Ukraine today. That's why it's important that Foreign Minister John Baird is in Eastern Europe talking to our NATO allies that are former Soviet states and talking to them about how important it is that we do stand together in solidarity and as committed partners to the NATO agreements, and that if Article 5 ever becomes called upon again, that we will stand with them to protect their territory. Now, that, of course, plays into the bigger context of balancing off what Russia is doing in Ukraine, as well as within Russia along the Ukrainians' eastern border and in the Black Sea. Mm-hmm. So we are extremely concerned and want to make sure that we get to those May 25th elections and provide a greater legitimacy to the acting president and this interim transitional government.
I got less than a minute for Peggy Nash and Mark Garneau, but very quickly, Ms. Nash, Mr. Garneau, what are you looking for ahead now in terms of the next step? More sanctions? What do you have your eye on, Peggy Nash?
Well, first of all, I think the resolve of NATO to provide security and stability in eastern Ukraine, I think that's the message that has to be sent, that the allies are going to stand with Ukraine and that Russia should stand back from this situation and allow democratic elections to go ahead. Enough of this kind of shadow boxing in eastern Ukraine. Let's have normal democratic elections and let people decide fairly with election observers there, as opposed to resorting to politics. That serves no one's interest.
Last word, Mr. Garneau?
I think what's important here is for the Ukrainian government to keep a very cool head. We don't want to give an excuse of provocation for Russia to go into East Ukraine. And secondly, in the long run, I think sanctions are going to have to work their way through, and it does take quite a while for them to really bite.
All right, I got to leave it there. We're watching the situation very closely. The American Vice President, Mr. Biden, is now in Ukraine, and of course, John Baird goes to Eastern Europe, the NATO allies, tomorrow. James Bezan, Peggy Nash, Mark Garneau, appreciate that. Thanks.
Thank you.